Hi and welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharad Kutin. With me, Mr. Ali Raza. He's a Regional Director for Southeast Asia for the Beaconhouse Group. We're talking about education, the Pakistani experience, the experience that's actually in some ways quite global now, with the need for schools and for education systems to anticipate the future. That's what you were talking about in the segment before. Fascinating that you have this conference, the future of education. What do you call future school?
School of Tomorrow.
School of Tomorrow. Lovely idea there. Tell us about the public-private partnership. You said there was an experiment in Pakistan around Islamabad, seen as a model perhaps to be replicated across Pakistan. But so what exactly were the main parts of this machine that you wanted to create?
Okay, so there are different models of public-private partnership if we talk about education. So when I was working for the Pakistan Center for Philanthropy, there was a USAID funded project where we were to develop some partnership models. So the idea essentially is that it could be the private sector, because they have quality standards, they've got certain interventions which are working and which are, I mean, they are imparting quality of teaching and learning, and that is precisely why they're kind of successful. So it is creating some kind of a bond or some kind of a bridge between the private sector and the public sector, where the private sector can help the public sector with a lot of these interventions in improving the overall quality of teaching and learning. Say, for example, Beaconhouse would be very keen to train your teachers in the public sector. So we've been very keen, so that's one model. The other model which we used to practice in Pakistan was creating, going to the corporate sector, which has a corporate social responsibility, and most of these corporate entities are more keen to work in the social sector, so be it health or education. So because education is again one of those areas where a lot of corporate entities have their focus on. So the other way could be that we could come up with a tripartite kind of an agreement whereby the corporate sector provides the resources or perhaps financial resources. They involve a partner like us who's providing all the expertise, and we are benefiting the public education system. So this could be a tripartite kind of a model, or it could be one-on-one between the public sector and the private sector, wherever whatever we can do, or whatever interventions we can replicate at the public sector, we are more than willing to help them out.
Okay, so how successful was it? I mean, did you, on the corporate side, how much were they willing to give? Were they willing to give? What kind of deliverables did they want? So on and so forth. Was it easy to roll out this program that you have?
Well, actually, interestingly, it was, because normally the corporate sector have apprehensions of working directly with the government. Nobody wants to get entangled with the bureaucracy and all those things. So when we stepped in, we said, we are your face. You provide with all the financial and other resources, let's say improving the physical infrastructure of those schools, providing access, which essentially meant buses and all that, plus improving the quality of teachers, where we would arrange for our trainers to go in and train those teachers. So it was kind of, all the financial resources were coming from the corporate sector, and we were providing all the software of improving the quality of teaching and learning. So I mean, that's really how that model worked, and then we were able to replicate this in other provinces also. This was other successful.
Right. So okay. So what is the end result of a program like this? Is it merely the strengthening in the public school sector? Is it transformation in the way government thinks about how it is going to provide education? How far-reaching is a program like this?
Well, I think it's, so normally what the corporate sector would do, that they would essentially focus on certain schools. So it was more like an adopt a school program, where they would adopt those schools and they would take complete ownership of those schools. So the quality of teaching and learning, let's say one of the indicators of success was the enrollment before the adoption and the increase in enrollment after, let's say, 6 months to a year. Because once we started to provide quality in those public sector schools, a lot of these low-fee private schools in and around that area started to close down. Because I mean, once the parents had that kind of confidence with the public sector, they started to move their kids to the public sector. So I mean, that's really, and of course, these corporate entities, because they're using their name with that particular school, so they make sure that they provide and they kind of sustain whatever is happening in those schools.
Yeah, sustainable is very interesting, because if it's funded essentially by the private sector, if the private sector, for whatever reason, because there are ups and downs in the global economy and in business cycles, is there a sense that they might at some point pull out, and will that jeopardize the program?
Well, not really, because I think once they have kind of adopted a school, let's say for 2 years or 3 years, they would end up fixing the physical infrastructure, which is, I mean, if we look at the cost of all these interventions, physical infrastructure would be the most expensive. So once the building or they've been able to create that conducive learning environment, so that one expense is gone. After that, let's say once the teachers are trained and they start teaching, then I mean, the costs actually go quite substantially low, because then all you need to do is to just keep providing those trainings, I mean, reinforcing those trainings once in a while. So it's not something where the corporate has committed a lot of money. It's the initial cost where they would end up spending a lot, but then sustaining it would not really require a lot of amounts. In fact, there were certain cases where certain corporate entities would adopt one school, and in the next year they would adopt another school. So I mean, they would just start adopting schools because they still had that amount to kind of spend as part of their corporate social responsibility. So they were adopting schools, and most of these schools were actually around their factory areas. So their labor was also coming from the same catchment areas. So they were improving the quality of teaching for the laborers' kids who were coming to. Right. So it was a kind of win-win situation for. Right. So that's really how the model.
Okay. I know you've only been in Malaysia for a year, at least based here for less than a year. Okay, so maybe a bit much to ask you to kind of weigh in on the Malaysian situation. To the extent that you know the conversations here locally around education, what do you think the Pakistan experience can say to Malaysians who are now grappling, whether it's policymakers or parents, grappling with the idea of improving education? Well,
I think it actually boils down to so all these interventions which we did in Pakistan, I think it boils down to one most important factor, that is improving the quality of teaching and learning. I've seen some of your public sector schools. I'm very impressed by the physical infrastructure of those. I think they're in a much better shape than anywhere else. So I think it's about the quality of teaching and learning, which essentially means that we need to focus on the teachers. We need to provide them with constant training. We need to give them the pedagogy or the methodology of teaching. I mean, that's really the quality of, that's the only way to improve the quality of teaching and learning. So I mean, so there was a time when we were teaching to exam, you know, so it was all kind of rote learning, and we were just encouraging these students to just pass the exam, teach to exam, which is, and a lot of chalk and talk and very regimented environment. I think now we have to move out of that. So the real difference between the public and the private sector is that we are working on developing a holistic personality for that child. So we want to have that, I mean, the development is to create critical thinkers who can think, you know. So if it's teach to exam all the time, then I don't think we are able to produce the product we want to produce. So I think it is how we anticipate that product to be like, and just reverse engineer the process. I mean, that's really how we work.
I wish kids were more like cars. Okay, we've run out of time. It was wonderful talking to you. I learned a lot. I've been speaking to Mr. Ali Raza. He's the Regional Director for Southeast Asia for Beaconhouse Group. We've been talking about education. It's a topic that we'll keep coming back to over and over again. This has been Let's Talk. I'm Sharif, only for Astro Wani.